given me a very potent cue through which one can begin. But before I directly address the question that you posed, I think, the fact that we are having to conduct a discussion on blended learning on Google Meet itself is quite ironic. But it's a productive irony insofar as what has happened for the past, let's say, 16 minutes has again proved, right, that what we are what is being forced down our gullies is perhaps a space of absolute mayhem, right? So where people can't join on time, right? People are getting bumped off. So there are all kinds of contingencies, right? And these contingencies do not necessarily only relate to, let's say, the availability of resource, but also a certain kind of a permanent contingency of technology that we are faced against. Right, and that is exactly what maneuvers this passage to the digital. Right, so now what I'll do is I will try addressing your question, and also perhaps hope that in the course of answering your question, which is going to be a debate about why this push towards blended learning, given the experience that we've already had with online education, given what the pandemic has forced us to confront, why is there this kind of a policy push, right? So, or a policy transition into blended learning, right? So, are we so blind to what we have been kind of made to confront over the past 1.5 years nearly, right? So this is, I think, a very, very important question. I will try and speak largely in English, as I'm given to believe that a lot of people might not be familiar with other languages, etc., and perhaps English can work as that kind of a lingua franca. But of course, if there are problems that people face in understanding what I'm saying, please do stop me, interrupt me, or you could just post a comment in the chat box, and I will try and translate myself into a mutually accessible language, or perhaps try and translate myself into a lesser English, which is obviously always a better English, right? So so we can do that. Now, I think the reason why, if one were to just directly address the question that you've asked, which is why, given the kind of complaints that we've faced with regards to online learning, both in terms of access as well as in terms of, let's say, competence, right? So both in terms of access as well as competence, right? So, or entitlement as well as knowledge, right? So the kind of challenges that we've faced over the past 1.5 years with online learning, right? So is something that we should have learned our lessons out of, right? So clearly we should have used this experience in the past 1.5 years to learn something about where online learning is headed. But despite what we have faced, what we are currently being forced to confront is pretty much a repeat, right? So, and perhaps an even more lopsided and half-baked kind of a rehashing, right, so of the online mode through this concept of blended learning. Now, the direct answer to this question is that we haven't been able to take a lesson from what has happened to us, precisely because what has happened to us over the past 1.5 years, right, so has nothing to do with this move towards blended learning. The push towards blended learning or online education or digital education is something that actually predates the pandemic, right? And precisely because it has got very little to do with the immediate circumstances or the situation of the pandemic, right? So it is something that has automatically become the policy rationale for the future. It's not as if the pandemic is what has taught us the benefits of online learning, and therefore we want to embrace it in fuller and more, let's say, worthwhile ways in the days to come. Rather, the push towards online learning learning has been underwritten within Indian higher educational policy way before the pandemic actually rolled out. And that is something that we have to understand in terms of the policy underpinnings, right? And which is why I hope that we will have the patience to try and look at, right, what the higher education sector in India has been proposing as a policy template, as a policy imagination, even before the pandemic. Interestingly, that blended learning has very little to do with the pandemic, or perhaps nothing to do with the pandemic, is absolutely apparent if you look at the concept note that the UGC has published. The concept note is an exercise in banality, right? So the concept note is what one should read in order to know how not to write a paper, right? So if you really need to know how not to sell an idea, you must read the UGC's concept note, right? So that's like an exercise. It's a lesson in what can bomb your idea, right? So, but this is something that we've been talking about in our own circles, is that one would imagine that a concept note is about marketing an idea, right? So a concept note is basically a summary of something new, something that you're proposing as an alternative, right? So that is a concept note. A concept note basically introduces a new field of interest or research or whatever. That is what the idea of a concept note is, right? So there has to be some kind of a conceptual underpinning, right? So there has to be some new ideas that a concept note should ideally introduce, right? And on the other hand would be, let's say, UGC regulations or guidelines, right? Which are basically legislative documents. Now, a set of UGC regulations actually reads way more interesting, or at least way more engaging, than what you have as the concept note on blended learning. So that itself gives out a proof of what we are in for, right? So if the quality of the pudding is in the tasting of it, right? So if you really need to know, right, so what we are in for, then all you need to do is read that concept note. It's a fairly short document. It's about 46 pages or something, and I think everybody should read it, right? So not just to know what is being proposed for the future of Indian higher education, but also to know how not to write a concept note. Now, the concept note basically goes out and says, just to explain what blended learning in the UGC's vocabulary is, right? So as we all know, right, so blended learning would mean, right, so a mishmash, right? So as there's this word that the concept note actually uses in the context of something else, right? So in the context of what it calls liberal education, right? So it calls it a potpourri, right? So which means, right, so a mixture. Right, so in familiar terms, right, so it would mean a hodgepodge, right? So a blended learning model, right, so is basically a coming together of the physical in-person model of learning, modes of learning, with online digital means of learning or teaching learning. That's a dictionary definition of blended learning. Right, so but in the UGC's conceptual understanding of blended learning, the definition that has been set out is that a blended learning model is basically a blend of appropriate means and adequate infrastructure. It is a blend of good education and participatory learning. So blended learning is nothing but a blend, right? And it is an example of how the UGC defined world-class universities, right? So what is a world-class university? A world-class university must have world-class infrastructure. A world-class university must have world-class faculty. A world-class university must have world-class library. So it is almost self-referential. Similarly, blended learning is a blend of the good and the better, right? So of the best and the few, right? So a blended learning is just a blend of the appropriate and the adequate, right? So and the best and the better than the best, right? So that is what the UGC proposes as the definition for blended learning, right? So you know that this is a kind of self-reflection in some imaginary mirror, right? So that is being proposed to you as blended learning. Now, as I said, right, so it does not take too much of effort to know what is the relationship between blended learning and the pandemic. And all that one needs to do is go back to this concept note and realize that not once in that entire concept note has the word pandemic ever come up. Right? So the word pandemic does not appear within that 46 or 48 pages of a concept note even once. There is one mention of COVID, and that too in the context of the way in which examinations were conducted during COVID time, right? So clearly, right, so this is not a document that is emerging out of lessons that we have learned over the past 1.5 years, right? Because if that were the referential framework, if that is the framework from which we have learned the benefits of blended learning, then the referential framework should have been mentioned. There is no mention whatsoever, right? Clearly, blended learning is something that was planned way before the pandemic. It's only that the pandemic has given it a certain kind of providential sanction. It has only brought a certain kind of divine legitimacy along with it. Right, so it has almost made it the only possible way out, right? And the pandemic has therefore been used. It has basically been milked to its best and its furthest limits, right? And the pandemic has merely been therefore used as an excuse, right? In order to manufacture a certain kind of public opinion. And it is on the basis of that public opinion that this document stands out as the proposal for the future of Indian higher education. Now, when I say that the preparation for this was in place way before the blended learning notification from the UGC, when am I talking about? Right? So what do I mean way before? What does this phrase way before mean? When did the preparation for this actually begin? Now, I would say it is around the time that the concept of online education and blended education failed in the US, around the time that it actually bombed in the US Academy, that we picked it up, right? And that's a larger policy debate, which I will get into in some time, perhaps in the second part of the conversation. But if you look back at, let's say, American higher education, you would realize that the concept of blended learning, along with fully online programs of higher education, actually got a massive, let's say, push in American academia right after the recession of 2008, right? And it was proposed as an austerity program, right? So through which certain funding cuts could be made across public universities in the US. So both online education and blended education were actually proposed as antidotes for larger macroeconomic shifts that were happening in the US, right? So, and primarily in the context of the 2008 recession, right? And you would see that it was around 2011, 2012, that all these MOOCs were being floated by the best universities in the US, right? So companies like Coursera, which were all basically Silicon Valley projects, right? So which were all partnerships with the Silicon Valley, right? So Coursera, edX, Udacity, right? So all of these would go out and partner with the best institutions in the US, use their brand value, right? So this is something that somebody called Christopher Newfield calls the leveraged buyout model, right? So it's like a private equity model, right? So where you use a public institution's reputation, goodwill, brand reputation, and basically allow private capital, right? So private venture capitalists to tap into that kind of reputation and then create a certain kind of a PPP model, right? So that was pretty much, right? And this is something that Newfield calls the leveraged buyout model, right? So where you leveraged the reputation or the brand capital, right, so of public institutions in order to boost the private edtech sector, educational technology sector, right? Now, this was happening in the US largely, therefore, right, so from 2011 to 2016. Right, so, and by 2016, the bubble of online education had actually burst in the US. Right, so which is why you would see that in the US right now, right, so now that the US seems to have actually lived past the horrors of the pandemic, or so it believes, right, so the US is actually not gung-ho at all about online education. Right, so American institutions, American universities are actually returning to the physical instruction mode, are actually constantly trying to get back into the in-person physical teaching mode. And they do not want to, even within policy, let's say, cliques, even within policy, let's say, coteries of opinion, there is no enthusiasm about online education or blended education in the US. Right, so because online education and blended education had already bombed in the US. How it bombed is something that I will come into, right? So I can give you the exact statistics, and I will give you some part of that, right? So it bombed in the US by around 2016. And it is around 2015, 2016 that we picked it up. Right, so this has almost become a policy habit for us, right? So all the discarded models from the US is what we must take as the biblical paradigms for or let's say the best and the most excellent paradigms for growth, and right, so all the discarded models become best practices for us. Best practices is a very, very important term, right? So in, let's say, bureaucratic vocabulary, right? So and I don't know whether some of you might have read David Graeber, right? So David Graeber talks about structural stupidity, right? So as the manifestation of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is nothing but structural stupidity, right? So how do you therefore mask structural stupidity? By using terms like excellence, best practices, etc. Right, so that is what we do, right? So we take the discarded models from the US and we make them into best practices in policy discourse, right? So we picked it up precisely around that time when the charm of online education had actually exploded in the US. And why do I say we picked it up around that time? You would remember that in 2015, the UGC proposed, right, so almost as a mandatory one-size-fits-all structure for all universities and colleges of the country, something called the choice-based credit system, CBCS, right? And it was rammed down. It was basically rammed in across all institutions of the country for the next 3 years. But it was into 2015 that this entire plot was hatched, soon after the 4-year undergraduate program instituted by the erstwhile UPA government had failed in Delhi University. There had to be a substitute for the 4-year undergraduate program in a different name, right? So old wine in new bottle is what you had to basically kind of manufacture. And we had something called the choice-based credit system, right? Now, what was the choice-based credit system all about? I would suggest, and I will tell you why I suggest this, right? So I would suggest that the introduction of the CBCS in 2015 was basically a prologue to partial onlining or digitization of higher education in the country through a concept called credit transfer. Right? So this word, I mean, this term called credit transfer came about through the CBCS, right? And it was said that students enrolled in one institution can do one course at one institution in one semester and then go out and do other courses from other institutions in other semesters, right? Now, this very concept of credit transfer, which now the blended learning concept note would talk about in the form of something called the ABC, right? So the academic bank of credits, right? So which is what will make possible this transfer of credits between and across institutions. The concept of credit transfer could not have been possible without online education, without a partial onlining of education, and which was already laid the ground for through certain cross-departmental, inter-college and let's say cross-university courses that were called the ability enhancement compulsory courses, or the skill enhancement courses. I don't know whether you know this terminology. Do you guys know this terminology? Some of you might be familiar with it. But there were all these compulsory courses which were introduced through the CBCS, which were called the AECC or the SEC, right? So which were compulsory courses to be done by all departments within an institution and all institutions within the university, right? So which means you are creating a general pool of students, right? So for which you cannot provide infrastructure enough, because if all students of the institution are to do this one ACC or SEC course, you will have to provide the size of a classroom that you won't be able to provide. You will have to provide basic physical infrastructure that you won't be able to provide. You will have to recruit faculty that you won't be able to recruit, right? So you create these pools of courses that can therefore, because they are cross-departmental and automatically enroll a mass of students, the best way to conduct these courses is to create online modules for these courses, right? So by which means you will not be needed to create physical infrastructures anymore, and yet you can actually enroll masses of students and bolster your enrollment ratio, right? So you can increase your enrollments without increasing infrastructure. And that is what it made possible through the CBCS in 2015, right? Now, soon after 2015, when CBCS was rammed in and it was said that the same curriculum has to be taught with only a minor deviation, right? So initially it was said that only 20% deviation can be made in the overall curriculum, overarching curriculum that was framed for the country by the UGC, which basically meant that Delhi University and some handpicked teachers of Delhi University, right, are handpicked by the then VC, right? So some handpicked teachers of Delhi University were sitting together and preparing a course, right? So basically outsourcing it to the UGC, and the UGC ramming it down across all institutions, 52,000 institutions in the country, and saying that all of you will have to teach the same course with 20 to 30% deviation. Right, so one size fits all structure, and there was a massive uproar, right? So, but much of the uproar did not eventually come in the public media glare, precisely because what is not happening in Delhi doesn't quite come in the public media, right? So, but of course, the obvious questions that were being asked was that how do you expect a student in St. Stephen's College or Hindu College to be studying the same syllabus as students in, let's say, Sundarban Deshi Hazarat College, right? So, or for that matter, Pathor Pratima College, right? So as if the classroom is this space which is evacuated of historical differences of privilege and disprivilege, right? So as if this classroom is a blank slate, right? So what you're working with is a tabula rasa, right? And that is the assumption there. Right. So, of course, but CBCS was proposed, despite the fact that immediately it could not achieve the purpose, right, because of all these discrepancies, right, so structural discrepancies in terms of historical, let's say, injustice, right, so in terms of the gradations of historical injustice across class, caste, region, community, gender, etc. So, but 2015 CBCS comes in with the direct implication, and this is the underwriting, right? So this is the trace that we have to basically find in policy documents with a bit of a microscopic kind of reading, right? So that was the underwriting within the CBCS vision document, that there has to be some kind of a credit transfer possible across institutions, which wouldn't have been physically possible, which couldn't have been infrastructurally made possible, had there been no plan for an online transition, right? Now, when the UGC realized that CBCS was, of course, becoming a very, very difficult module to handle, right? So when it realized that they had actually created some part of Frankenstein's monster that they can't quite monitor the movements of, right? So what they did was they actually brought in a set of regulations in 2016, which is the first direct naming of online education and MOOCs, right? So by the UGC in 2016, right? So they brought in a set of regulations where they went out and said that any institution which does not have the required faculty to teach a particular elective paper can opt for online courses, can opt for Swayam or MOOC courses, which is basically then going out and giving institutions the leeway to not recruit teachers at all, right? And yet to offer elective papers in the online mode. Right? And this happened through a legislative document in 2016. Then comes the NEP and the bad word, right? So I don't know whether it's really a bad word for huge chunks of the liberal intelligentsia yet, but nonetheless, right? So I think, it's something that we have to try and again read the finer print of, right? So the NEP, as we all know, right, so of course, there's a history to the NEP, right? So the first draft of the NEP was prepared by a committee called the Subramaniam Committee which submitted its report and which was published in 2016, but it did not go down very well with the government, right? And because it did not go down well with the government, they completely chucked that report. Right, so that was the initial draft of the NEP. Then there was a new committee which was set up under the chairmanship of K. Kasturi Rangan. Right, and Kasturi Rangan committee, right, so submitted its report, which was the draft NEP, in December 2018. Right, when the pandemic was something that we hadn't even been able to sniff. Right, in December 2018, the Kasturi Rangan committee submitted its draft NEP, which was thereafter released and ceremonially unveiled by the Modi government soon after it galloped back to power in May 2019. And it was at the end of May 2019, right, so that the Kasturi Rangan committee report was made public, a 484-page document. Now, the devil lies in the detail of the NEP. Right, so, and that is where we have to actually try and read the policy arithmetic. Now, the NEP says a fantastic thing, right? So, almost a magical thing, right? So, the NEP says that the problem with Indian higher education is its excessive fragmentation, right? So, we have too many colleges and we have too few students, right? So and it proposes a magic formula to cure this malaise called Indian higher education, right? So which has only been producing anti-national students and anti-India slogans, right? So it goes out and proposes a magical formula. What is that magical formula? It goes out and says that the purpose of the NEP would be to lay out a roadmap by which we could increase the gross enrollment ratio in higher education to a double of what it currently is, right? And it says that currently the gross enrollment ratio in the country for higher education is 26.3, which means that in the higher education age bracket, which is 18 to 23, right? So given the population of 18 to 23 years, right? So out of every 100 people that we have, right, so of the age group 18 to 23, only about 26 people can access higher education. Now, the NEP goes out and says that we will have to increase this GER to 50. Right, so from 26.3, we will increase it to 50, which means that we will double the enrollments in higher education. But at the same time, what will we do? We will reduce the number of institutions to 1/4 of its current spread. And you have its exact arithmetic laid out there. It says that we will have to reduce the number of institutions in the country from 52,000 to 12,300. So what you are doing is you are proposing that the number of institutions will become 1/4 of its current size and the number of students will become double. Now, on the face of it, this seems like an alchemical possibility, right? So this seems like UGC really has some kind of magical touchstone through which it can really work numbers out. But at that time, it did seem quite puzzling. But of course, the underwriting there is again nothing but online education, right? online education was that magic formula through which you can cut down on institutional infrastructures. You can actually go out and build what is called college complexes, right? And which is again something that the concept note on blended learning mentions. It talks about clustering 10 colleges, 10 institutions, right? So every 10 institutions must be clustered as a minimum requirement for going out and conducting online blended learning, right? So it talks about college complexes. So you fuse 10 institutions into one. So you reduce the number of institutions, you reduce the infrastructural liability of the state, and yet you can potentially bolster enrollments because whoever has a smartphone and whoever has data, and the government can very easily provide you data, right? So if the government is relieved of the cost of actually providing for physical infrastructures, physical university infrastructures, the government can easily provide doles of data to everybody who's enrolling for an online program, right? So, and we know, right, so the kind of intimate, let's say, erotic alliances that happen within our nation, right, so between, let's say, private capital and the state, right, so we know how this is possible, right? So it is very easy for the government to go out and give monthly doles of geo data, right, so to every student enrolling for an online course, right? So because if you do not have to run institutions, if you do not have to pay for electricity, water, stationery, maintenance staff, right? So as well as all other kinds of social reproductive labor that intellectual production requires, right? So if you do not have to pay for any of this within the institution, you can very easily make data, right? So the reward for going out and enrolling in an online course. Right? So that is exactly what was being proposed, that everybody who has a smartphone, right, so can potentially log into the adventure of higher education, right? And for that, you really do not need institutions anymore. And that is something that is very clearly underwritten, right? So within the document called the Kasturirangan Committee report, and which was thereafter again kind of manipulated, and which was basically taken the summary out of, right, so in terms of the NEP 2020, in terms of the final National Education Policy 2020, right, so which went on to basically rehash these same policy suggestions. Now, there are finer things which I can talk about as we go on, right? So, but that's what is happening, right? So from 2018 to 2020. So you have 2015 CBCS and the concept of credit transfer, which was to basically inaugurate the conditions for online learning. Then you had 2016 actually giving, in 2016, you have the UGC regulations actually giving out a legislative sanction, right? So giving out a legislative escape route to institutions for not recruiting teachers in specific subject areas and in elective subject areas, right? So as long as one has MOOC options to offer from, right? And then from 2018 to 2020, you have the specter of a new educational policy being pruned and sharpened and created into this monster, right? So called the NEP 2020, which goes on to say that we can now safely go out and cut down on the number of institutions and get double enrollments. Now, the NEP 2020 is what the concept note on blended learning actually sings elaborate eulogies to, right? So it spends a lot of labor and effort in praising the NEP 2020, right? So saying that the NEP 2020 has spoken of something called the fourth industrial revolution, and what we are proposing through blended learning is the fourth educational revolution, education 4.0, and all of that. But there's a very, I think, an irony within the concept note on blended learning, which needs to be relished, right? So what the concept note on blended learning actually does is that it calls out all the lies of the NEP, right? So it actually busts all the myths that the NEP had proposed, right? And all this hawa of liberal education that was built by the NEP, right, of teaching liberal arts in professional technical management institutions is finally called out, right, so is finally called the bluff on, right, so by the concept note on blended learning. How is something that we can go into, but clearly, as you can understand, right, so through this rather brief history, and of course, right, so soon after the NEP got released, the final NEP got unveiled, and it was unveiled by the cabinet, right, so with just a mere cabinet approval, without even routing it through the parliament, etc. Right, and the government, of course, used the pandemic as an emergency, let's say, circumstance, right, so through which they could basically ram the NEP in. Now, so from 2015 to 2020, you had this entire history, and soon after the NEP got unveiled, right, so what you had in September 2020 was again another set of UGC regulations on online programs, right, so which went out and said that in order to run a Center for Online Education, which is called a COE, right, so one doesn't need to have any kind of physical space requirement. You don't need any physical infrastructure, right? And there is a detailed section on physical infrastructure which does not say a word about the infrastructural liability of a Center for Online Education. So basically, you can just hire a room and run a Center for Online Education, which is approved by the UGC from that one room. Right, so you do not need any kind of infrastructure whatsoever. Now, on top of that, what happens is in that document you are told that while teachers are going to be only made into facilitators of these online programs, there are 8 grades of technical solutions experts. Right, so that will have to be recruited by these centers for online education in order for programs to be run. So basically, teachers are reduced to informal care workers, and the people who will take the place of teachers will be basically technical solutions experts, right, so who will have to be thereafter hired by the university, right, so in order to run these centers for online education. So that happened in September 2020, and thereafter you have this missile from the UGC about introducing blended learning to the extent of 40% at the least, and a maximum of 70%, which is something that we are missing out on. That same document goes out and says that institutions can now go out and digitize a minimum of 40% of their course content into let's say digitally accessible material, right? So you can go out and transition 40% of your course load online at the least, and the maximum is 70%. So that's clearly the arithmetic there. So between 40 to 70% of your course component is what you can easily go out and transfer online as part of this entire concept note for blended learning. And again, that same document says in the same breath that even within the online component that you are devising, if we think that there are going to be lectures given by recorded lectures, right, by the faculty, etc., we are sadly mistaken, because the document says it in as many words that a maximum of 40% of that online component can be lectures by teachers. Right, so you are basically again informalizing the whole of the teaching sector and the academic sector, right? So to let's say unorganized care work, right? So that is all that the teacher must do, and instead, what you will swell the ranks of would be technical solutions experts. You will basically give a massive boost to the EdTech capital, right? So educational technology, the private educational technology capital is where you are actually pushing the entire higher education sector to. If you look at the blended learning document, you will realize that the entire document is filled with private platforms, which are all licensed platforms, right? So for which, most of which are licensed platforms, and most of which institutions will have to buy the licenses of in order to use, right? So it's a massive kind of rejuvenation of the telecommunications sector, right? So that one is staring at through this kind of a blended learning module. Now, this is where, right, and to just kind of bring my answer to the first question to a close, right? So it's been a fairly long answer, but to bring this to a close, right? So I think it's important for us to ask a very basic question, and a question that comes up. Let's say I will use a Latin phrase, and a Latin phrase that we keep using all the time, right? So the question is cui bono, right? So in the interest of whom are we doing this? Right? Cui bono, C-U-I-B-O-N-O, right? So it's a Latin phrase which basically means for whose profit are we doing this? Right? So for whose interest are we doing it? The government would tell you that it is for or in the interests of the public. If you just go out and read the blended learning document, you will realize that it is directly in the interests of private capital. That is precisely the primum mobile, right? So the unmoved mover, right? So behind all of this, right? That is where all the money is going, and that is where all the money is going to go, right? So I was just today, we had to, I had to take my family to the vaccination center, and this was Sarvodaya Vidyalaya here in Delhi. And so, of course, the school teachers were made to work as observation, so basically with the clinical observation monitors, if you want to call it that, right? So they were the monitors for clinical observation after you get the vaccine shot. And so there was this one gentleman of a teacher who was sitting there, and we started talking to this teacher. And he told us that something very predictable, but of course something that I didn't know, that this is something that has been happening within schools as well, right? So in 2019, spoken English courses were outsourced by all Delhi schools, 1100 Delhi schools, to private online agencies. And every month, 1 lakh rupees per school was spent in paying these online agencies, right? So these edtech agencies to conduct spoken English courses, right? Now, what happened apparently, because all the teachers have now been made into vaccination personnel, right? So the schools have gone out and given the task of online learning again to private online agencies, private digital edtech agencies, right? So apparently there is an academy called Fame Academy, which is famous for online educational solutions, which has been given the task of providing mathematics lessons to the students since 2020, right? So that's where the money is going. So clearly the primum mobile, as I said, right? And interestingly, you guys used, I am just completely floored by the choice of the poster that you guys, the choice of the image on the poster that you guys made, right? So which is a fresco by Raphael, right? Called the School of Athens, right? And the label on top of that fresco, right? So the original label on top of that fresco said something called causarum cognitio, which means a knowledge of the causes, right? So the knowledge of the principle of first causes, right? So the primum mobile, one has to know what is the first cause, right? So who is the self-created God here? The self-created God is nothing but capital, right? So the unmoved mover of this entire business of blended learning is capital. Right, and we can talk more about this in a bit. Yes, over to you, Moon.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for the answer. So basically, we should not see this as a independent or isolated move or a very revolutionary move, but it is in line with the neoliberal policies that Indian government has been taking for quite a long time. So I think we should, open the floor for audience to ask the questions. If there are any questions from the audience, please unmute and
absolutely
ask.
Hello. Yeah. First, thank you for your brilliant talk. My first question is the same as your. So I actually completed my graduation, post graduation from Testu University. So I actually faced the the CBSE thing. Okay, so there are several languages, but those languages are the foreign language. Foreign language means Germany, German, France, such kind of thing. Okay, so I think the CBSE not only push for the online, but also change the pressure dynamics. Pressure dynamics means now student has to bear the pressure to go to the other institute and talk and search for the other subjects, means such kind of things, means yeah, so kind of the education the administration so actually lose the pressure to from the soldier to the student, because I know that is actually very hectic to find a completely separate subject. I am from physical sciences, so I have to choose a separate subjects, separate department. So that's kind of a hectic for us actually, for the students. Yeah.
Correct. Thank you, Ranveer. I think that's a very useful suggestion, and yes, that is exactly the kind of pressure that's created. That is exactly the kind of ways in which both public perceptions are being manufactured, as well as certain kinds of policy moves are also being structured. Right. So I think and this constant evacuation of educational resources, right, so from public funded institutions, or for that matter, let's say government schools, right, so is something that goes on to thereafter destroy the credibility of government schools, right, so of public funded schools, right. So that is what the government actually wants. It wants us to it wants the general public to know that government school teachers cannot teach maths. Right, so they cannot teach basic mathematics, and which is why we are having to employ agencies like FAME,
Yes.
right, so to go out and impart online lessons. They want us to know that government schools have already failed in imparting basic literacy or numeracy, and therefore you need the participation, or you are basically kind of forced into seeking participation from private players in the sector. So public-private partnership as a model also requires the prior making up of, or let's say creation of a ground, right? So in terms of public consensus, and that is what is happening. So I think, thank you, Ranveer. That was a very, very fruitful suggestion. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I really found several points very insightful. I wanted to ask you about what do you think is going to come for us next in this situation? Is there going to be a sort of a breakdown of the education system and then the sort of rebuilding, or do you think are we heading towards a sort of an inevitable permanent disaster?
Well, okay. I think that's again a very necessary question, but I don't want to sound like a prophet of doom, right? So because I do have a lot of hope, and I do think that if we can build up a concerted movement against what the evident policy moves are, or the evident policy directions are, there are possibilities of the government being forced to at least backtrack, right? So if not entirely kind of shelve these projects, right? So now what we are faced with is a slightly, is a bit of a prophecy for me to make, right? So, but I'm not going to kind of predict what we are faced with, but I think what we are faced with in terms of the task ahead is something that we really need to know. Right, so not merely do, let's say, certain permutative kind of predictions about what the government can do. Right, so let us not speculate about what the government can do. We will have to do that kind of speculation and maneuver our moves nonetheless. But what we can, at least at our level, do is prepare for the fight ahead. Right, we can at least try and tactically join ranks, right, with organizations, with student platforms, with teacher associations, and try and create a concerted critique, right? So a solid critique of blended learning. It doesn't take too much of intellectual effort to bust this concept note that the UGC has published, right? So I told you what kind of intellectual bankruptcy it already reeks of, right? So I told you what kind of poverty of the imagination it comes with, right? So it doesn't take too much of labor to explode this entire rubbish, to explode this kind of industry of garbage, right? So therefore, right, so we have to basically join ranks and think of alternative manifestos, right, so for higher education, and which is what I think is the task ahead of us. Now, on that note, I think because it's a useful question and a question that actually prepares us for the road ahead, right? So I think that the directions are fairly clear, right? So where the government is pushing us is something that is fairly clear. Now, why the government is pushing us in these directions is something that we have to now try and think about. Now, we cannot basically also languish in our polemic around the university as being this absolute space for liberation, because the university is no space for intellectual emancipation as well, and we must know it, right? So we know that the university or the higher education institution has also had its historical crimes, and it has, right? So it has been divided on class, caste, gender, community lines, and there are all kinds of class solidarities that structure the history of the university. All kinds of gender solidarities, communal solidarities, as well as, right, so caste solidarities that structure the history of the university. We know it, right? So, and that is exactly what the government is using. The government is using, right? Why do you think that the government in its national education policy begins by talking about the minimal outreach of higher education in the country, right? And saying that we have excessive fragmentation, too many colleges and too few people, right? So, and too few people is something that it thereafter goes on to give us the statistics of. It says that only 1/4 of the college going education has access to college education, which is dismal. Right, so which is indeed dismal, right? So 70 years into the history of post-colonial policy making for the country, right? So if 1/4 of college-going populations in India can really access higher education, right? So then it is really a shame, and that is something that the government is basically creating an image of a failure through. The government is first creating an effigy of the public university and then setting fire to it, right? So it is first telling you that look at the public university and how has it failed. It has failed to ensure excellence. It has failed to ensure social or economic justice, right? You have not been able to reach out to the population of the country, right? So you have not been able to either ensure social mobility or economic justice. None of which, right? So neither have you been able to go out and perform your economic redistributive agendas, nor have you proposed, nor have you actually achieved social justice, right? So for the populations that you seem to be catering, right? So that you claim to be catering to, right? So it has gone out and first painted that picture of the public university as a colossal failure. Right? A failure in terms of the number of institutions vis-a-vis the minimal outreach, right? So which automatically then tells the government, oh, if only 26.3 is the GER, then on an average, imagine 73.7% of the college-going population is outside of the college sector, which means you have 105 million college-going populations, right? So 5 million people of the college-going age who you can actually outsource to the private edtech sector in terms of data, in terms of, let's say, the maneuvering of public resources. Right? So that is the mass of people that are still untapped within higher education. And who must you sell it to? Obviously, private capital. Right? So such huge profits to be reaped out of it, right? So that is, and thereafter the government goes out and says that, and even where the public university has gone out and kind of provided the kind of education that it claims to stand for, the kind of humanistic education that it claims to stand for, what has it given birth to? It has given birth to seditious slogans and anti-national scavengers on national wealth. Right? So you have either not provided education to the socially marginalized, or to the privileged few who you have provided education to, you have ranged them against national interests. So what must you do now? Therefore, we must create an antidote, right? And that antidote is, right, so you have more for less, right? So that is the funda, right? So you, very interestingly, the NEP says something very, I mean, these are the kinds of jumlas that we have to actually talk about, right? So light but tight regulation, more for less, right? So you will have more students coming in for less infrastructural costs, right? And that is online education, right? So that is basically what the government is creating its effigy of the public education sector out of, right? And thereafter it goes on to suggest that therefore online education could be a potential means of ensuring more efficient and cheaper educational delivery, right? So to a larger segment of the population. Now, what will happen to this is something that one can cite statistics for, which I will, as I said, right, I will get into in a bit, right? So, but exactly that is something that we also have to keep in mind, right? What the government has proposed as the failure, as the colossal failure of public education in the country, on the basis of which a push for private edtech capital is being proposed. There are several other things, but of course, I think, I mean, the point about liberal education is something that I will get into if anybody wants to know more about it. Yeah, but I think what we need to do, therefore, is have a clear sight about what we are faced with, right? So how is the government maneuvering its own moves, right? Rather than just shooting our arrows in the air. I personally think that there's a lot that we can do, right? So because this online education model is, okay, I'm sorry I'm taking so much of time, but this online education model is one way of actually preventing, as you all know, right? So preventing any kind of public investment in higher education, number one. Number two, preventing the harvest of anti-national sociality, right? So which is possible only when students come together, right? So which is possible only when students inhabit the physical space of the university. Right? So if you confine them to their homes and their phone screens, then there is no possibility of a dissensual sociality, right? So for dissent. So you want to forestall, right? So what does the NEP come close on the heels of? The anti-CAA movement, the anti-NRC movement, right? So, and who were the biggest stakeholders there, right? So along with the women who we had seen marching out of their homes, right? So along with all the Muslim women that we had seen that we had seen marching out of their homes, who were the apprentices to that movement? The students were. So what do you need to do? You have to basically distance the student from the social. And that is what you do through, I mean, so social distancing is basically the purpose of online education, right? So, and the third is all the non-intellectual sectors of labor. As I said, right? A university does not live precisely because students and teachers go there and teach and learn, right? So a university cannot survive on the backs of students and teachers alone. What about the cleaners? What about the malis? What about the caretakers? What about the canteen workers? Right? So what about that entire informal, non-intellectual workforce? Right? So which depends on the physical infrastructure of the university. In one fell swoop, you can clean the entire university of this entire informal workforce. It's like a Swachh Bharat scheme being launched on the physical university. And in one swoop, you have all non-intellectual workers eliminated from the university. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, there is a question on Facebook. I'll be
Right.
just reading the question.
Yeah.
Is not the educational sector, especially online mode, being used by the government in a subtle way to create a neo-Manuvadi social discrimination in India?
Absolutely. I think it's a question that is partly rhetorical, right? So, yes, of course. I mean, that is the purpose. Of course, how it happens is very interesting, right? So now, I do think, and this is my opinion, that I do think that as much as we understand the ideological implications of what policy proposes, we have to now learn to somehow stay away from the bigger ideological words, right? So we have to try and use slightly more, let's say, non-ideological polemic, right? So in order to reach out to people. But you are absolutely right. I think you are bang on, right? And what better proof of it, right? So than the invitation to private philanthropy in the schooling sector, right? So where you have the World Bank coming in with something called the STAR scheme, right? So, and where it pumps in money in the name of teacher training and knowledge management, and goes out. And so what you have in the village schools right now, right? And that is what the government is proposing, right? So that in the district schools and the village schools, through school complexes, what you are going to enable is a nexus of private philanthropy in the name of private philanthropy, or obviously we know what, right? So RSS shakhas and the World Bank. So the World Bank is basically going to train, right? So the shakha population to go out and conduct education at the schooling level, right? And on the other hand, in the college sector, in the higher education sector, there is something fantastic that the government has cooked up. Now, I think somewhere we have to give it to the government, right? So for learning the terms of critique so very well, right? So the government cooks up, and which is what, right? So a lot of our own ilk was completely kind of taken in by, right? So this entire trumpeting of something called liberal education, right? That the NEP goes out and proposes as the destiny of higher education in the country. And all these liberal folks across the country in the teaching sector and let's say the liberal intelligentsia goes bonkers. Oh my God, right? So look at what is happening, right? So we've never had a government come out and talk about liberal arts being introduced in technology and management institutes. And here is a fascist government talking about introducing liberal arts in technology institutes, management institutes, professional institutions, and all of that. Now, there's a larger politics to that, and we have to learn to understand, and we have to perhaps look a little deeper. Now, why is there sudden shift? Why is there this absolutely inexplicable shift, a sudden shift from the neoliberal register of higher education to a liberal register of higher education? And that too by the most illiberal government in the history of perhaps, right? So let's say political administration, right? So a government that has faced the greatest flack from the liberal intelligentsia, right, finally goes out and woos the liberal intelligentsia by going out and say that here is your reward, right? So go out and teach liberal arts, right? Now, why does it do that? Now, the reason is, and it's very clear in the NEP document itself, right? So the NEP document makes no pretension of proposing that you will get jobs after you come out with a degree, right? So it is very, very clear on that count, right? So it goes out and says that the task of higher education is not to prepare the student for his or her first job, but for her second job, her third job, her fourth job, her fifth job. Basically saying that what you're faced with is informal labor contracts, right? So with a higher education degree, all that you will be basically made into is cheap, semi-skilled informal labor. So you have no jobs in the country. right? And if you look at government data, if you compare All India Survey on Higher Education data 2017-18 with, let's say, the periodic labor force PLFS data 2017-18 from the same period, right? So there was one other AISHE report that came out after that, but I'm using the 2017-18 data because that is the last PLFS data that is out in the public domain. So if you compare the PLFS data, labor force survey data, with the survey on higher education data of the same period, you will see, and this is the government saying it, you will see that 18 out of 26 male students coming out of the college sector do not get even informally employed. 20 out of 25 female students coming out of the college sector do not get a job, even informally. So and that is the state of the economy. So in an economy where you don't have jobs, what do? Either you go out and label an entire population as illegal migrants and therefore rob them from basic civil, political, and social rights, or what do you do with this entire mass of students coming out of the higher education sector with degrees? You teach them a certain kind of citizenship in the name of liberal education. Either you turn a part of them into non-citizens, or you train them into a certain kind of citizenly behavior. And that is why liberal education becomes the fetish of anyone. It is about training the people coming out of the higher education sector who will never land jobs into a certain kind of civic imagination, where they can learn to identify the Muslim as the one who has come and scavenged on my land and my job. So if you can't provide a job, turn people into disgruntled citizens. And that is the logic of the liberal that is being used. So the liberal, so that is why I think, the liberal education proposed by the NEP is about securing legitimacy for the kind of laws passed in the parliament. What is being passed as a law in the parliament is what you secure legitimacy for at the level of ideology. And where do you do it? In the school, in the college, right? So basic Althusser, right? So you basically use the state apparatuses.
So if there are no other questions, let us move on to the next section.
Yeah, I think I've taken too much of time, but yeah, I hope.
Yeah, so before moving on, I would just like to say that the poster that you talked about, it was made by Kalaji Pradeep. She is a fifth-year physics major student in our institute.
Oh, fantastic! Wow, yeah. I thought I'm very interested in philosophy, right? So I thought, could I have her name once again?
Her name is Kalaji Pradeep.
Kalaji. Okay, Kalaji Pradeep, thank you so much. I think it's a brilliant poster. And when I looked at the poster, I thought this is my entry point into today's discussion, right? So because the School of Athens, incidentally, the poster, as you know, right? So that painting, which is basically a fresco done by this Renaissance painter called Raphael, right? So has the figures of Plato and Aristotle, as you would know, right? So the eyes have been scratched out, but it's Plato and Aristotle. And the older man is Plato, and the younger guy is, of course, Aristotle. And Plato, and both of them are carrying their books in their hands. Right? So I can share my screen and show you. Can I do that? Can I show you the poster? Yeah. Poster. Yeah. Okay. So I will. Let me see if I can do this. How does one? Yeah. Present now. Yeah, can you see?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So this is the fresco, right? So by Raphael, right? And you have the older man who's Plato, and the younger man is, of course, Aristotle. And Plato, very interestingly, right, so is carrying a copy of Timaeus, right? So while Aristotle is carrying a copy of Ethics, right? And you will see the names here, right? So Timaeus is what Plato is at. So there's been a lot of conversation about the hand gestures, right? I just found out, and I was talking to a friend about all of this as well, right? So I just found out that there's been a lot of debate about the hand gestures that the two philosophers are making, right? So Plato is pointing upwards towards the heaven, right? So the idea, right, of the good, the god, the soul of the earth, right? So, and then there is Aristotle, right? So almost pointing horizontally towards materiality, to the world of matter, right? So Timaeus and ethics. Now, very interestingly, okay. Yeah. So very interestingly, Timaeus is, I was thinking about this just before the talk, that Timaeus is actually perhaps, there's a lot of debate on it, right? One of the first scientific treatises in the history of classical thought, right? And it is a reflection on, as we all know, the nature of the universe. Right, so it is a reflection on the nature of the universe and the formation of the universe, and it divides the universe into two parts. Now, what are those two parts? The physical world and the metaphysical world, the physical and the virtual. Right, so and the physical is what Plato calls the changeable world, right? So, and the virtual or the metaphysical world is the unchangeable world, right? So the eternal world. Now, contrary to, I have a point that I can make about this, but perhaps at the end, right? So, contrary to what we think the virtual is, we think that the virtual is dynamic. We think the virtual is the changing, the mutable, right? Plato had said at the time of writing the Timaeus that actually the virtual is the eternal, right? So the virtual is the universal, and very problematically so. And the physical world is driven by, right, so what Plato calls the principle of necessity, right? So, and the only characteristic of the physical world that Plato talks about in the Timaeus is its changeability, is its mutability. Now, what is mutability? Mutability is nothing but the foundational principle of democracy. What is democracy? Democracy is precisely in its own fragility. The fragile is the democratic. Right? So democracy is precisely in that self-consciousness of the fragility of the universal general will. The will of the people is fragile. Right? So change is nothing but the very cardinal, the what one can call the condition of possibility of democracy. Right? And that is rooted in the physical world, not in the virtual world, which is the eternal, according to Plato. Right? So Plato, of course, uses the word globus for the first time, actually, in Latin. Right? So in a way, the virtual is, according to Plato, the metaphysical is the global. Right? So globalization, in a way, if one wants to look for a theory of globalization, one can find it in Plato as well. Right? So, and yes, and it was okay.
I just have a, it might sound a polemical question, but I think I would still ask it, because this is something that has been bothering me for a while during your talk. So you have talked about blight, you have talked about estrangement that is going to happen, deindustrialization, and also, credit transfer, right? So credit transfer also presupposes an accumulation of debt, right?
Oh, yes.
So otherwise,
yes,
there is nothing, right? So since you have used quite a few industrial metaphors, and quite rightly so, because this education system has developed as an analogical space with factories, right? So public health factory, etc. So all are on the wane, and we have seen deindustrialization in all sectors. So it's flight of capital, blight. Of course, you are right. And then what struck me was this transfer of credit. So a transfer of credit presupposes an accumulation of debt and also debit, right? So what is being debited, and what debt is being accumulated at the societal level? So that is my question.
Okay, I think that's a fantastic question, and it's a question that I'm still grappling with. But of course, it's a question that has come up within my imaginative attempts at trying to kind of work with policy, which is, for example, just the use of the phrase academic bank of credits.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
Right. So that is in itself such a telling metaphor of how the state is basically trying to create a debtor-creditor relationship between the student and the state. Right. So what you are basically trying to be, I mean, what the state is basically trying to make out of students is primordial debtors, if I can again use David Graeber's term, right? So debt first 5,000 years, right? So it is almost a primordial debt that we have to pay to the nation by selling cheap labor to the nation, right? So, and in return for which, what do we get? We get credit, right? So credit points. So this entire vocabulary is taken from a certain kind of a loaning imagination, right? As you rightly pointed out, right? So the debit credit accounting of labor. Now, so of course the debt here, I think, right? So if one were to look at it in that along that metaphor, the debt here is a primordial debt, right? So it's a debt that one has to pay to the nation, right? So it's a debt that one cannot pay. It's an unpayable debt, right? So which can only be partially repaid through what one can call peonage, right? So debt peonage, through pawnship, right? So by pawning away your labor, right? So the degree becomes a bill of exchange. Right, so, and the degree carries all those credit points, right? So 64 credit points and whatever, right? So 96 credit points. So you have basically earned credit from the state, and you must sell those credits, right? So through the sale of labor, right? So through the sale of cheap labor power. So I think, I mean, that's a very potentially a very pregnant metaphor, and a metaphor that actually calls for a lot of discussion, and especially within the kind of policy directions that we are seeing with the coming of HEFA, loans from the HEFA, right? So this entire movement
going to that direction, actually.
Right? So this movement from the subsidy model to the loan financial assistance model. Right, so which is again a movement from, let's say, funding public institutions to funding private individuals. Right. So a direct move towards privatization. Right. So subsidy is about funding institutions. Loan is about funding individuals. Right. So, and of course here there are institutional loans also. Right. So through HEFA and all of that. Right. So which will have to be paid again through internal accruals. Right. So which is student fees. Right, so you, through student fee revenue, you will have to pay back the loan of the state, right? So there is a clear move, right, so from funding institutions to funding individuals through assistance packages, right? So through need-based assistance packages, or even better, merit-based assistance packages, right? So all this scholarship model, right? So you get a lot of talk about scholarships nowadays. Now it's a very, very dangerous move. Right, so this move from subsidy models of funding education, scholarship, fellowship, right, and financial assistance model of funding education, where you are saying that now we are no longer going to fund institutions. Individuals who need help must provide documentary proof and then claim it, which they will have to repay again, if not in cash, right? So of course there is always that specter of it, right? So if not in direct let's say cash, but through labor, right? So through labor contracts with the state. So it's a combination of that kind of a primordial debt model with, let's say, a more immediate, let's say, neoliberal model of this movement from the public to the private, right? So a movement into the privatized model of funding. I don't know if but yeah.
No, of course.
We have two comments in the chat box.
Right.
Anthony Joseph.
Right.
So he says,
I think, absolutely. I think it's a comment. Yeah, so as Moyuk said, these are comments. This is the banking concept of education in which the scope of action allowed to students extends only far as. Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what it is. Right, so there are going to be bills of exchange given, and it is all a speculative economy. This is what, in a way, this is what Gerald Davis calls the stock market model. Right, so this is the stock market model of funding education. Right, so where you are only giving out certain debt tokens to the student in the name of credits, which the student must thereafter go into the market and sell. Right, so through the direct sale of labor power. Right, so it's a debt peonage model that we have here, and it's of course a logical culmination of Paulo Freire's postulation around the banking.
So before moving on to my next question, I would just like to make a comment. I mean, you said that, I would just like to repeat it. What you said about with the shift to the online mode, there will be a retrenchment of the non-intellectual sector within the institute. That, sadly, that's what we are seeing in our institute right now. There is a policy to cut down the workforce, and this is going on actually.
Absolutely.
And our students fought back.
Yes, that's the hope. Yeah. Yes, please, Ritu.
I just wanted to say that our students and workers fought back.
Fantastic. I think, that's the only hope, right? So if the students don't fight back, then all our talk of social exclusion will finally remain confined to the Centers for Studies in Social Exclusion and Inclusive Policy, right? So that is where it will all stop, right? And which are anyway facing flack from the government right now, as we all know, since 2017, right? So with the installation of something called the Niti Aayog in place of the Planning Commission, right? So the Centers for Women's Studies and the Centers for Studies in Social Exclusion are all being shut down. Right, so there's a constant threat of shutting down these centers. So because that is where the threat comes from, right? So if you become aware of human rights and women's rights and social exclusion and inclusive policy, then you will start fighting for the struggles of the precariat on campus, right? So, and that is incidentally, this is something that I keep talking about all the time, and this is something that one can find in a lot of people, a lot of let's say philosophical imaginations around the university. The only way in which the university can survive is by engaging in a dialogue with the life that it excludes, and the people, as you said, the non-intellectual sector within the university is the life that the university excludes. And the life that the university excludes, in a way, is physically within that university. That is the population that online education actually tries to physically evict from the university.
And I just want to add one particular thing, not connected to this, but a previous point, when you were talking about legitimacy building and liberal education that they're pumping into this thing. I saw a policy document in our institute, for example, in which, big board members are talking about introducing soft skill education. So yes, in HSS departments, in humanities and social sciences departments, you will have old model education kind of modules being available. So this is also coming. So liberal education has a very specific meaning to this incumbent regime.
Yeah, absolutely. It's entirely that entire. It's obviously a moral imagination of citizenly behavior, right? So that one is going to be trained into, right? So the Delhi University has conducted, again, handpicked members of Delhi University, right? So the Delhi University went out and instituted a committee called the NEP Implementation Committee, right? So talk about being more loyal than the king, and you have Delhi University playing its role. So, the Delhi University constituted a committee called the NEP Implementation Committee, and that committee had 14 meetings from October 2020 to February 2021, and came out with a template for multidisciplinary liberal education that is to be offered as part of the NEP's proposed blueprint. And the kind of courses that you have there are called ethics and culture, right? Or the sort that one finds in, or let's say, emotional learning. Right, so these are the kinds of courses, right? So that will be offered, again, on a cross-departmental, inter-institutional, online basis.
Yeah, so I think so in the same trend, so can see the so some of us actually go through the NEP document. Okay,
Right.
so the first line of the vision of the policy. So it says the NEP envisions an education system that rooted in the Indian ethos that contributes directly to transforming India.
Right.
That is Bharat. Okay, so I have to specify the name Bharat, and then again, so in the multi-language education, they talk about the Ek Bharat. So I think
Shrestha Bharat,
Shrestha Bharat. So I think that is kind of a culture training. They have to go to the
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is exactly the meaning of the liberal education that one will be given.
Yes,
Right.
yes,
So,
yes.
and of course, I mean, it's there are so many productive contradictions within the NEP document, which the blended learning document actually goes out and calls the bluff on, as I said. Right. So they work at cross purposes. It's funny, but it's so funny that it's cruel. Right. So that's the problem.
So one short comment is that so you can see so in the child education system, so I think they term it as ECCE or something. Means
Early childhood.
Early child care something.
Care and education.
So they actually saying that they has to train the Anganwadi. So I can say clearly that for Assam, Tripura, Mizoram, Manipur. So they are actually Anganwadi workers are struggling for this for their job actually. So I think ironically, so present NEP actually so combines the struggle of the student, same as Moyuk said, the informal sector of institute and the Anganwadi. So this is actually they actually combine everything.
Absolutely. Ranbir, I'm really happy that you've read the NEP document with such, let's say, detailed attention and with such meticulous attention. That's fantastic. You've just hit the nail on the head, right? So that they are talking about extending formal education, right? So at the pre-primary level, right? So to include ECCE, right? And they talk about making it part of the RTE Act, right? So the right to education, right? So which means that including years 3 to 6, right? So the primary sector, right? So which is ages 3 to 6 is what they are proposing about bringing within formal education. But how do they do it? Through Anganwadi workers who are paid 4,500 rupees a month.
Yes.
So that's and they have to, and what does it go out and say? That these Anganwadi workers will have to enroll for online courses, 6-month teacher training online programs, and thereafter go out and impart early childhood care and education for 4,500 rupees. Right. So there is no talk about an increase in the salaries of even granting, let's say, daily minimum wage to Anganwadi workers. So thank you. I think that's very important. Yeah.
So I have one more question for you. So the next question.
Right.
So this is, this is from the UGC plan of blended learning. So the first figure that they provide. So they title it Educational Transformations.
Yeah.
And they give 5 points. One is pick teachers and timings for flexibility and quality. Frame your courses for needs and interests. Design your courses, so student centricity. Study through any mode, real world, learning or exams on demand when ready. So this kind of creates a image that it's very, what should I say? I mean, it will be student run and also a very democratic kind of thing, and it's more accessible. So, could you please discuss on this?
Okay. I think, that would pretty much become the second part of my discussion, but I'll just keep it short, right? So that we can have another round of
Yeah,
discussions.
I
perhaps.
meant it as the second part.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Thank you. So, so basically, here is where the promised statistics that I have been kind of dangling in front of you, right? So, could actually come in, right? So, and so the government, of course, is proposing blended education as a more democratic alternative to the traditional brick and mortar university, right? And needless to say that the initial enrollments will indeed exponentially increase, right? So with blended learning, right? So there will be a massive boom in the initial enrollments. But the fallout of this is something that will remain invisible and completely unrecognized, will be the increase in dropouts. And that is what can be borne out by data from the countries which have already gone out and implemented online education or MOOCs, right, so in their histories, right? So the government is saying that yes, if we introduce blended learning, a lot of people who have not had access to traditional university education, who have not been able to dream of entering the precincts of the university, precisely the life that the university excludes, will actually be able to log into, as I said, right, so the adventure of higher education. Right? And it's true that a lot of, for example, the adult male working populations with just a smartphone, right, or a lot of, particularly, right, and this is something that is important for us to register, right, so a lot of people from the socially marginalized communities, right, so the SC, ST, OBC, women, and the religious minorities, right, so Muslim populations, right, will actually initially get a chance to log into higher education, who otherwise are excluded from the experience of it. But what happens thereafter is where the actual merit or demerit of the system lies. Now, as I said, this entire policy move has been tested in the US, and therefore we could use the American precedent as a global archive, right? So as some kind of an archive through which we can learn our lessons, right? So we have to use the force of global precedent in order to understand what it has done. Now, in the US, there is data which says that with the introduction of online courses, about 67% of initial enrollments dropped out by the third year of a course. And who are the people who usually drop out? It's those people who haven't had the right to intellectual labor or intellectual training, who haven't had the prior socialization into intellectual labor. Which would mean that those same constituencies of the population that you are saying you will cater to through online education are the people who you will force into dropping out by the third year of the program. And that is why what is the government saying? We will have multiple exit points. That is the logic of multiple exit points. It's about institutionalizing dropouts. There is no survey, official survey in this country that documents dropouts in higher education. There is a lot of garbage that is produced about enrollments, right? So there are hundreds of documents that wax eloquent about enrollments, but there is no official report that documents the number of dropouts from higher education in this country, right? So dropouts are already invisible within higher education. And multiple exit options will only make them even more invisible, right? So that is one way of institutionalizing and therefore invisibilizing dropouts. And this is something that one can get from US universities, where you have online programs being run with 8,700 enrollments in the first year. And the numbers have plummeted to 3,358 by the start of the third year. From 8,700 students opting for a program, for a MOOC program, in the first year, you have 3,358 at the beginning of the third, which means about 67%, 2/3 of your student population are forced to be eliminated, are forcefully eliminated from the education sector in the course of 2 years. Why are they forced to drop out? Obviously, because the intellectual requirements of a course without any kind of human contact and without any kind of physical infrastructural support, right, is massive. Right? So those intellectual requirements cannot be fulfilled until and unless one is socialized into routines of intellectual labor. Until and unless one has had the right to what one can call intellectual talim. And we know in our country, the right to intellectual labor is obviously determined on the basis of caste, class, gender, community, region. Right? So therefore, you will even inevitably end up maximizing dropouts while at the same time maximizing enrollments. But what you will talk about would be enrollments, and what you will make completely invisible would be the dropouts. Because you will give everybody a certificate degree, or let's say a diploma degree, with which they will go out and find nothing, right? So you are basically training people into becoming, as I said, semi-skilled, cheap, informal labor. Right? You are increasing the number of years of training, right? So you are making it a 4-year undergraduate program, right? So, but by instituting exit options at the end of every year, right? So you are basically saying that whoever cannot afford 4 years of higher education can drop out. Please go out. Welcome. The door is open. Get out of here. Right? And historically, it has been proven that the people who will be forced to drop out are the people who you will trumpet the statistics of in terms of democratization. It will be the same communities who you claim to actually be catering to. Right? So number one. Number two, again from the American example, there is statistics to tell you that with the introduction of online education in 2011, between 2011 and 2016, right? So with the introduction of online education and blended education, completion rates, course completion rates or graduation rates in America in the online programs plummeted to 1/8 of regular university programs and 1/4 of community college programs. Online programs in the US have had the highest attrition rate in the history of higher education, and which is why the US learned its lessons. And the US, as I said, right, so the US is not orgasming over a return to online education at all. Right, so that is the statistical minefield, right? And that is stuff that one has to again take one's lessons out of. So one has to, and which is why I think one of the issues or one of the arguments that we constantly use, right, so as a resistance to online education, is the access arithmetic. Right, so that how will people get access to technological resources? Right, so we talk about the digital divide. Right, so we talk about differential technological access. Right, so on the basis of caste, class, region, community, gender, etc. Right, so and we say that the primary problem with online education is access, but that is the arithmetic that the government will learn to overcome at the slightest pretext and in the easiest of ways, because access at the entry level does not take too much of effort to correct. right? So at the level of enrollment, access does not take too much of effort. And if you have, as I said earlier, right, so if you can save the entire cost of running physical, if you can actually save up on that front, if you can save up on the electricity, the water, the stationery, the social reproduction of a university, of a brick and mortar university, the maintenance and upkeep of a university, that is money enough to get into contract with private edtech capital or to get into contract with Ambani's, right? And give out Reliance Geopacks to everybody who opts for an online course. So access at the entry level is easier to correct. But differential rights of intellectual labor and the habits that they produce and reproduce, right? So let me just put it in simpler terms. Access at the entry level, I hope this is clear. Access at the entry level is easy to correct, but access is not enough in education. For success to be measured in formal educational terms, you have to persist. It is persistence that is more important. And for persistence, what is required is certain habits of the mind. You need certain habits of intellectual training and rigor, which are the products of generations of intellectual training. Right? So generations of talim, which the socially deprived communities are sorely left out of the possibility. So what is important is not merely access. What is important is persistence. And persistence requires habits which you cannot find. Right? So because of historical damages caused by the inequities of caste and class and gender, habits are what are forestalled. Intellectual habits of the mind. And that is where you will force people to drop out, because they cannot sustain or survive the rigor that an online program takes without any kind of physical hand-holding that a classroom space is all about. Okay, so I think I'll stop here and perhaps take. I hope I have answered your question, Moyu.
Yeah. So let us take questions from the audience.
Yeah.
If there are any.
Yeah.
If there are any questions on Facebook.
Sure.
Since our audience doesn't have any question here.
Okay. Well, that's okay. That's perfectly okay. I think I will just take 5 minutes, or let's say a couple of minutes, to talk about the philosophical kind of digression that I had made, and I again want to applaud, right, so students of ISER, right, so, and which is something that I'm completely, as I said, completely floored by, right, so that you guys thought of putting that image. Now I was saying that Plato is carrying in his hand, right, so Timaeus, right? And Timaeus, as I said, right, so is a reflection on the formation of the physical world vis-a-vis the metaphysical or the virtual world, right? So in a way, and Plato says that the difference between the physical and the metaphysical or the virtual, right? So he doesn't use the word virtual, but it of course means in our own context, the virtual, right? So the difference between the physical and the metaphysical is precisely in their relative fragility, right? So is in their relative mutability, right? So while the physical world is constantly changing, right? So the virtual world is forever eternal. It is based on an idea. Right, and that is what Plato would call, right, so the god, right, so the creator, right, so the demiurgos, right, so that is what Plato uses, the demiurge, right, so the demiurgos, right, so it's based on the idea, and the idea of what? The idea of a form. That is what Plato calls it. And what is that form? According to Plato, that form is the sphere, the globe, the globus. So for him, the metaphysical world is what is expressed through the globe, through the form of the universe. So globality for Plato is universal and unchangeable. Right? So in a way, while globalization claims to be dynamic and introduce that element of competition and dynamism, right, into the everyday practice of into the practice of everyday life, right? So where you go out and sell and buy labor, right? So according to Plato, and which is exactly the principle that we are living with, right? So the virtual is actually the universal and the eternal. It is based on an idea of global access, which there is none. And on the other hand is the physical, which is rooted in the principle of change. And the principle of change is precisely the principle of the democratic. Right? So the condition of possibility of democracy is the changeability of will.
Hello. Yeah. So in the same trend that you said, the Plato,
Right.
Plato's concept of the
Right.
virtual.
Right.
Yeah. So actually, so in the present NAP document is that handy blended learning thing.
Right.
One thing is that the physical interactions,
Right.
so that is completely blocked. High. I started school from a government school, so I can see that this kind of dialectical. Dialectical means so some of us can't able to understand or to speak fluently. So our teachers actually change the topic and change the things to for our good. Actually means the teacher actually change environment such that the students can learn things in the more better way.
Right.
But saying the online, so I think Mihir, Mohk, and the other can say it very clearly, but understand and feel very clearly because they are doing online course for almost 2 years, right? So yeah, so they are actually this environment and the dialectical communication is changed. I mean, it broke down. It means you are saying that every student that has to be responsible for their learning. It means you are not taking the responsibility for this thing actually. Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly what the state wants, right? So where the onus, now what is the principle behind public funded education? Right. So the principle behind public funded education is that since the provisioning of education is a constitutional commitment that the state has made, therefore the responsibility, as you rightly point out, the responsibility for evening out inequities of access, the responsibility for correcting inequities of access must lie with the state. Right? Now, with online education, what is being proposed is that even the infrastructures of accessing education, right, so do not lie with the state anymore. Right, so it lies with the student, the size of your mobile screen, right? So your the size of your RAM, right? So the memory space of your mobile, right? So so all of this will determine the quality of your education, right? So your bandwidth, your internet connection, right? So the size of the mobile screen, everything, right? So will be effectively determined, right? So the infrastructures of access will now also lie on the individual level.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
So, are there any other questions from the audience?
Excuse me? Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
So like I have a comment to make, like you can tell me whether it is right or not.
Right.
Like I think there is an implicit idea or a philosophy of education in this blended mode of learning, like a student is a passive taker of information and the teacher is an active giver, and like this giver taker relationship is, I think it is implicitly assumed. And what do you think about it? Like, yeah.
Absolutely, completely in agreement with you. But the only irony is in the fact, which I'm sure you would have noticed as well, that while the student is reduced to a passive recipient and the teacher to a facilitator, in other economic terms, in more economic terms, right? So it is basically a rehashing of that service provider and clientele logic. Right, so where somebody provides a service and somebody is the clientele. So this entire passive recipient versus the facilitator logic is actually manufactured in completely different terms. Right, so while the student is reduced in absolutely correct ways you put it, right, so that while the student is reduced to a passive recipient of knowledge as units, as commodities, right, so as let's say packaged units of data based consumption, right, so on the other hand, the same model of education is being peddled by the blended learning document as more participatory, as more learner centric, right, so imagine the irony there, right? So while actually it is just the opposite, right? So the vocabulary that is used for it is completely at every possible remove from what is happening, right? So while the student is going to be left on his own to deal with, as we were discussing, and I think Anthony has again hit the nail on the head, right? The student is left on his or her own to deal with precisely the iniquities of the cognitive habits of the mind, right? And these cognitive habits are, again, as we said, the results of generations of intellectual damage, right? So generations of intellectual damage caused by histories of deprivation, caused by histories of structural discrimination. Right, so you are left to address all those iniquities, right? So in terms of your intellectual habits, on your own, right? So with the mere enabler of technology, it is as if technology alone is the great leveler, right? And that is the problem, right? So, and that is called more participatory. That is called more student-centric, not even student-centric. The new word is learner. Right? So there is a again, I mean, these are philosophical debates, and these are debates that require a lot of conversation, which we will perhaps have time for some other time. But the word learning has a certain history to it. Right? So the word learning does not come into education from the beginning of formal education. Right, so learning is actually a neoliberal vocabulary, right? So, and it comes to take the place of education at a particular conjuncture in history, right? So, where the student becomes a learner.
Yeah, so if there are no other questions, I think we should conclude the event.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for taking out such a long span of time for us.
And it was my pleasure. It was absolutely my pleasure. Such brilliant questions. I must thank you.
Also, thank you for the wonderful discussion, and we'll love
and
to
I also hope that you will come back to us in informal discussions, because this group is quite vibrant, as you can see. And we also have a study circle along with this one, which is maybe Mayuk can say a few words about our study circle and its name and its history a little bit.
Yeah, so we have a study circle. It was based mostly in ISER. So it has been recently renamed to Savitribai Marx Ambedkar Study Circle.
Oh.
So we gathered together and discuss various literature, and even we discuss the original works of Marx, Lenin, Ambedkar, and other thinkers and social scientists. So
right.
I think it was set up in 2018.
No, before that.
Yeah,
It was
About
set up in
2017.
2017, if I am not wrong.
17. Yeah.
That's
2017.
Right?
Yeah. Yes.
So, yeah, Ranveer was one of the founders, right? So, yeah.
Yes. So we actually started, completed several texts actually, from state to state and revolution, the article of the state, then the E.P. Thompson book, on the working class of England. So we completed this. After that, so we have, we actually have the regular weekly meeting, but the problem is the pandemic. Because after pandemic, everything is blocked down.
We used to occupy a room, for instance, classroom,
yes.
we had a blackboard there, so we could do a lot of board work while reading those texts, for instance.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard some stories from Ritojyotida, right, about the wonderful variety of stuff that you guys do, but my respect to all of you, right? So my absolute respect and salam to all of you, right? So Krantikari ones, right? So I think, I mean, that's fantastic work, and this is the kind of work that will stay with us, right? So, and this is stuff that we've been trying to think about. Now, I keep referring to this one book that I have learned a great deal from, and that I structure my own imaginative manifesto for education through. And I would just kind of mention it in passing for you. It's called The Undercommons, right? So by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, right? So where they say something fantastic, and that is what I personally believe in. They say that the only relationship that one can have with the university is a criminal one, right? So which means what? Which means that one has to learn to steal the resources of the university for fugitive communities, right? So one has to learn to steal the resources, because these are resources that are funded by us. So when they say that you have to learn to steal the resources, they don't mean that you have to basically pocket the resources of the university. Don't walk away with the duster from the classroom. But what one has to do is one has to learn to redistribute the resources of the university for the life that it excludes. And that is, so the university must basically be the space for the poaching of those communities which it excludes. The university must become the poaching ground.
Yes.
Right? So it must be trespassed by people who are excluded by it. And we must create the conditions for it. I believe that one of the ways in which, and this is something that I've been genuinely kind of thinking about, I think one of the ways in which we can do this, it is through the night school on the university campus, on a public university campus, right? So if we could return to that kind of model, right? So, and which is going to be in absolute opposition to the state's tom-tomming of what it calls lifelong education. I'm not talking about lifelong education. I'm talking about night school for immigrants, right? So for the children of immigrant workers, right? So if we can do that, if we can make the public university become the space for running immigrant night schools, then it would be perhaps a return to the idea of the university.
Yeah. So one thing is that the scientific institutes like Faisal Mohali, IIT, TIFR, these are kind of outskirts. Means these are not in public domain.
Right.
So you can see. So for CA protest, so I have to so I usually go every day to Punjab University. So after that, I started protesting with Faisal Mohali and this thing. So this is one thing that scientific institute. So these are kind of not in the public field, means active public dynamics. These are outside. So I completed my post-graduation in Test University. So this is also in far out from the public domain. So this kind of is a separate dynamics kind of thing. So this is
Correct.
So one last thing is that please come to Aisha Mohali for any formal, informal discussion. So we have a
Yes.
cup of tea and
Absolutely.
discussing.
Yes, I am all for informal conversations and never for informal labor. Right? So, but yes, but informal conversations are what I'm always there for.
I just wanted to mention another point. I think to wrap up what Ranveer has been saying. So I was reading Sadler Commission report recently. It's a mammoth, big report written between 1916 and 1919. So in Sadler Commission report, Ashutosh Mukherjee is telling that Calcutta University has to be shifted from the central city to Baliganj, Rajabazar, and Alipur. Because in the emerging suburbs, because city becomes revolutionary if you have such a big university inside a congested urban quarters. And over and above that, it is also the nature of students that gets corrupted because of the presence of Sonagachi and all those, very, very corrupting places around Presidency and Calcutta University. So the very idea that the university has to be walled and that walled university has to be somewhere else, always somewhere else, not in the middle of an active neighborhood. And that makes this wall an epistemic wall as well, which we have to break internally. That is what is necessary, otherwise it's very difficult. The next universities, BHU, for example, Malabo was also there in this. So Malabo preferred to get a land which is far away from Benares, from the city. Actually, it is coming from there, very idea. Right. So then you have Jamia, you have HCU, JNU, all IITs. Those are all suburban campuses, actually, with a very, very defined wall, which is not the case with Delhi University or say Calcutta University. And the politics is very different there, therefore. So that's why I think in our context, it's very important to remember that we have to transcend the wall that is in front of us, separating us from the city, from the community. So that's very important. And we have to do it internally.
Absolutely.
To stretch the boundary.
Totally.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks for being there and asking these fabulous questions. Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, and we would like to have you in our other events and also informal discussions, maybe in the study group sometime.
Absolutely, it will be my pleasure. And
we start Paulo Freire and bring him for a guest lecture. That will be great.
Yes, absolutely.
Short book. We should read it.
I think if we could actually, it's a proposal, right? So which you can think of, right? So if one can actually read Paulo Freire and alongside Paulo Freire, right? So Jacques Rancière, the ignorant schoolmaster, right? So if we can, because they represent two completely different imaginative poles, right? So of how to reimagine education. So perhaps that could be one way of imagining a new manifesto for higher education. But anyway, I think the fight has to be on, and the fight has to be on in whichever ways we can, right? So by, of course, reimagining the university as the site of its own critique. We have to learn to critique the university even as we inhabit it.
And they know what critique means because I taught them over many, many classes.
Fantastic. And they are doing it.
Voluntary insubordination.
Yes, absolutely.
So, yes, of course.
Actually, you gave another, a much better word than that to us. That was the word autocritic within an autocratic institute.
Autocritic in an autocratic institute.
Yes, of course. Wow, yes. Fantastic. Great stuff happening. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Great.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye. See you guys. Bye.
Thank you.